Thank you, everyone. I won't be offended if you drift off after your submarine sandwich, but just know that God will know. My title today, and I think my timing on the length of this lecture is correct, so you're going to hear all of it, I think. My title today is of cicadas and mayflies. And if you hear about mayflies at the end, you'll know that we'll have actually reached the end of the talk, so you can begin to stretch your legs or rouse yourself from your slumbers. My argument this afternoon is a simple one, and most of its components will be familiar already to everyone gathered here. Because education is an initiation, a drawing of the self into the presence of truth, we may tend to think of it in wholly abstract, specular, and that's a word I'm going to need to return to probably in the questions, and disengaged terms as merely the movement of the reason from wonder to knowledge. But to the contrary, it's the movement of the whole of one's personality, the whole of the mind, the whole of the soul, and the whole of one's being, including the body, in the direction of its final end and its purpose. This entails revising that spectatorial view of education, where it's merely a looking on by way of abstraction, so that it more adequately can describe education as a pilgrimage and mystery involving the whole of one's life as an active participant in the truth. This argument in this panel is complicated, but only slightly, by the particular branch of education that we'll be addressing, and that is literary education. Because a specular understanding of education identifies the truth as a universal, and so also as an abstract reality, the idea of literature as a subject of study has always seemed a little baffling. Literary education always entails reading some one particular text, a concrete and singular reality. And to read it well, one has normally to fall in love with it in its particularity, to conclude by saying it is this or that particular book I have read and known rather than any other. The work studied, in short, is studied for its own sake as a good in itself. And yet, in our nervousness, we hasten on to account for this by turning back upon abstraction. This or that work is valuable because of a universal moral maxim it imparts, but also upon which it gives greater insight through its dramatic or expressive unfolding. Or, as in St. Augustine's day, the work is taken as exemplary of a kind of rhetorical template. It is a touchstone of style, acknowledged as excellent of its kind, but nonetheless one among many that could illustrate a ghostly pattern of speech that may be imitated and echoed. A further cause of bafflement lies in the place storytelling rightly takes in everyday life. The first kind of substantial speech and writing offered to children is typically storytelling. And so we come to think of stories as primordial ways of speaking, through concrete representation and illustration suitable for the immature and simple minds of the young, what may become their maturity at some later date, dished out wholly in the form of abstraction. This leads us to celebrate stories as foundational and necessary, but also to condescend to literary mimesis as merely a as yet unrealized media of abstractions. There can be no point in denying that these things are, in their place, true. Literature does illustrate and imitate, in the incarnate, that which is absolute, universal, and abstract. And it does often provide patterns in the concrete of universal qualities of character that its auditors may perceive, admire, and come to embody in their own character and actions. Literature does provide patterns of speech that we ourselves may incorporate into ourselves, thereby cultivating templates of expression and style. And the literary does indeed necessarily precede other modes of speech and writing in the life of a person, as being especially suitable to the state of the imagination and mind of the child. All who encounter the literary in their maturity also feel a kind of native familiarity when doing so, as if in some sense it involved return to the instinctive and native fluencies of childhood that require no explanation. True these things are in part, they tend to distort and limit our understanding of the whole. And so I'd like to offer 3 arguments or modes of approach that may at least draw us to a more adequate understanding of the role the literary or the poetic plays in education, and which further provides a clearer view of the ways in which education is a formation of the whole person, and not merely an activity of the disengaged and specular reason upon a series of abstractions. My argument will run as follows. Arguments. First, the literary, by which I mean all that pertains to poiesis and mythos broadly understood, establishes the human person on a journey of exodus and reditus, of procession and return, so that the literary constitutes the beginning of education, but also its final iconic fulfillment of the soul's vision of truth. Second, the work of art, literary or otherwise, is part of a way of knowing reality, and in 2 different manners. The act of making is itself a kind of knowledge of reality that is wholly embodied and incarnate. But also the made form is itself a reality, and in several senses a mimesis of reality, in the contemplation of which we may discern the nature or laws of reality. To this argument, we must add 2 things, one borrowing from St. Augustine, and the other replying to and rejecting the arguments of the great Thomist and historian of philosophy, Etienne Gilson. Augustine will help us to see how the patterns of our making may conform to the larger patterns of reality. Well, Gilson attempts, but without success, to create an unbridgeable chasm between the factivity of artistic making and the reflection of aesthetic appreciation. This claim of Gilson's must be overcome so that we can properly appreciate still a 3rd claim and a 3rd argument, that the reditus of education is finally, as Hans Urs von Balthasar would have us realize it, a kind of aesthetic dwelling, of seeing the concrete form without any kind of reduction or abstraction that would remove us from it. And I will conclude, all things being well, with a look at Richard Wilbur's poem, Mayflies, which comprehends wonderfully each of these 3 dimensions of education. So first, poiesis and mythos, broadly understood as establishing the person on a journey of exodus and reditus. Plato's Meno will serve as a prototypical text to explore this. For there we see mythos offered as the beginning of education, its foundation, and as a kind of exodus, while also hinting at the form of reditus, of return, the fulfillment of education as an act of returning to reality and truth. On the question of being between knowledge and ignorance, which is raised in the dialogue, Socrates introduces the immortality of the soul and the famous concept of anamnesis to explain the possibility of learning as an instance of being between nothing and something. And here in the dialogue, he says the following, and it's a lengthy quotation. The speakers were among the priests and priestesses whose care it is to be able to give an account of their practices. Pindar, too, says it, and many others of the divine among our poets. What they say is this: see whether you think they speak the truth. They say that the human soul is immortal. At times it comes to an end, which they call dying. At times it is reborn, but it is never destroyed. And one must therefore live one's life as piously as possible. And then Socrates quotes Pindar. And here it is. Persephone will return to the sun above the 9th year, the souls of those from whom she will exact punishments for old miseries. And from these come noble kings. mighty in strength, and greatest in wisdom. And for the rest of time, men will call them sacred heroes. Socrates continues in his own voice. As the soul is immortal, has been born often, and has seen all things here and in the underworld, there is nothing which it has not learned. So it is in no way surprising that it can recollect the things it knew before, anamnesis, both about virtue and other things. As the whole of nature is akin, and the soul has learned everything, nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, a process men call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire in the search. For searching and learning are, as a whole, recollection. This is a familiar passage, but perhaps for all that, the force of it has been lost on some of us. Its force comes to this. On the count of the immortality of the soul, of recollection or anamnesis, and the possibility of betweenness, what Aristotle will later clarify in terms of the formulation of potency and act, all these ideas figure centrally in Plato's philosophy, and they get introduced in this passage. But look what else we find in this passage that we might not have even been searching for. Priests and priestesses are not primarily guardians of mystery, but are those charged with giving accounts, taking stewardship over their practices. Here is a rare moment when a Greek philosopher agrees with Herodotus, the historian. Because as far as I know, it's Herodotus who thinks that the Egyptian priests and priestesses have the good knowledge on stuff. It's a little bit more complicated usually in Plato. Second, Pindar, the divine poet, is cited as an authority, and then he is quoted to get the discussion rolling. The quotation clearly refers to immortality and to the cycles of the soul, but it also speaks of punishment, humiliation, abasement as prior to and causal of one being reformed into the noble and mighty. And this is followed by another point, a description of learning, of the life of the philosopher in heroic terms, when Socrates returns speaking. By citing Pindar in this way, Socrates is able to make Pindar the source and even the occasion of his argument, the font of wisdom lodged firmly in the tradition that must be interpreted and drawn out of itself. This drawing out will take the form of Socrates' own argument. The poem occasions, then, an act of exodus where the movement of the mind sets out on its voyage from the harbor of poetry. Moreover, Pindar is, in an important sense, a source. While Socrates clearly has particular ideas on which he's already stated he wants to focus, the poetic verses become a source, and in so becoming, they reveal more and other things than Socrates had originally proposed. Pindar is bottomless. There's more to be retrieved from the verses than we might otherwise assume from Socrates' introduction of them. Pindar is not just a concrete illustration from which we set out, but he is a reality, a world to be explored, and that leads us or demands us to take such a journey. Pindar, in other words, will never merely be left behind like a provocative aphorism that stimulates us to thought. All Socrates' thought remains a reflection on Pindar. The source remains always before us, and to journey away from it is also to enter more deeply into it. The crucial, unanticipated disclosure in this quotation of Pindar is its suggestion of what learning means for Socrates. It involves humiliation, submitting the soul to being, and allowing it to be reformed. Philosophy is not a systematic taking possession. It is rather a submission and listening to being, and even a willingness to be punished. Learning is a kind of agon, and so the true heroism is that of the one who's willing to submit and suffer for the sake of true glory, of being one of the noble kings who is greatest in wisdom. This act of submission begins with the willingness to listen to the oracular wisdom of Pindar the poet, of being willing to hear an authority that is divine and more than human, and which cannot readily be reduced to the one or two ideas we personally care most about. We are not moving from concrete literary illustration to abstraction of discourse then, but into the verses, into them, as if they were the underworld into which the philosopher hero must descend, just as Odysseus once descended. Precious indeed is the capacity to provide an account for Socrates. It is heroic, but it does not distance itself from the poetic so clearly as we might otherwise be tempted to presume. In the Ion, a dialogue to which we'll return later in my remarks, Socrates offers an ironic account of the poet as lacking in knowledge, in specifically the capacity to provide an account of the words he speaks. And this has been rightly understood in the context of that dialogue as a criticism of poetry, and one that will be repeated in the Apology. Poets often seem wise, the Ion suggests, because of the words they speak. But they are not really wise, because they cannot provide the kind of account of their language that Socrates requires, and for which he, in the Meno, praises the priests and the priestesses. But this should not lead us to dismiss the authority of poetry, only to recognize that it has an authority of a peculiar kind. If we turn to the Phaedrus, we find that Socrates specifies the authority of the poet by showing us that there are three chief uses of language. And here I risk going off on a hobby horse, but I'm reaching the conclusion very gradually that Plato's Phaedrus has two questions that are related. What is man, and why is he always talking? And those are related, because man is a speaking animal. So for us to define three chief uses of language is to say something very important about who we are. Thank you for laughing, though. That was supposed to be funny. I just then realized, it's also true. So the truth is sometimes funny. Okay, so three chief uses of language. First, there's the speech of the sophist, who pretends to confident knowledge, but which is disingenuous, misleading, and manipulative. It sounds kind of like the Ion in that dialogue too. Sophistry is beneath reason and depends on its probability or likelihood in the mind of its audience in order to work its persuasive tricks. But then there is dialectical speech, the language of philosophy, where we give accounts to arrive at truth by way of understanding it. Philosophical dialectic is on par with reason, not beneath it, because it is a reason as human beings may know it. It also entails a kind of probability, the probability of the mind as it inquires after and approaches the truth, even as it recognizes that truth is a thing toward which we direct ourselves rather than a property that may be possessed within ourselves. Finally, a third kind of speech. There is the language of myth and poetry. This kind of speech, Socrates notes in response to a question from Phaedrus, is just the kind that would seem to invite his contempt, irony, and inquisition, all leading to its dismissal. To the contrary, Socrates subsequently shows myth and poetic speech is akin to what we may call a hieroglyph, an icon, or a symbol. It shows through figural speech, in brief, what dialectical reasoning could only show at great length. And I'd like to say I owe that discovery entirely to Plotinus, who actually speaks of language as hieroglyphic, but since David Schindler's right in front of me, I have to admit it comes from him, at least originally. At least originally for me, not in the tradition. It's hard to speak with him right there. So, okay. Poetic speech is above reason, but it is not to be compared to sophistry, which holds reason in contempt and so is beneath it. Like rhetoric and dialectic, it also deals in probability, but the probabilities of a manifest iconic wholeness in whose depths we trust, even though they will never fully disclose their truth to us, and whose appearance we cannot directly question. Socrates can quote Pindar. He can treat him as a source, but he can't question him directly. So what is inexhaustible, we can approach but never comprehend, as an asymptote approaches a line as it moves toward infinity. We see this twice in the dialogue, the Phaedrus, with special clarity. First, Socrates states that he spends all his time trying to discover if he is a kind of mythical beast made for savage destruction, or if he's a being made to participate in the divine. Why does he do this? Because the temple of Apollo is inscribed with the imperative, know thyself. That is to say, the silent motto of divine myth, spoken in stone from the oracle of the god of wisdom, commands his obedience. Myth precedes rational inquiry, sets it in motion, and brooks no questioning. Here, myth and poetry appear as occasions for exodus, the setting forth of the soul on its journey towards the truth. But later, Socrates will use myth to disclose the answer to the question that I just raised. What is man? Who am I? Unable to define the soul by means of dialectic, he will simply paint it by poetry and myth as a chariot with a pilot and two winged horses, one refractory and one docile. Myth thereby precedes reason, sets it in motion, but also fulfills it as if by a kind of excess, disclosing an image which many words will not suffice to explain. And the one translation of this passage in the Phaedrus is especially wonderful. Some translations will say, like, the gods never tire of saying this sort of thing or something. But I think the focused translation, Socrates says, Phaedrus, it would take a god and a long time to tell you what the soul is. Like, even if you were God, you'd still be here past dinner. It's very good. We never journey beyond myth, but rather return to it as the fulfillment of our act of readiness when we complete the journey of truth and return to reality and come to a clearer perception of it, a perception that begins in myth but finally ends in a perception that still involves myth. Readers of the Phaedrus will recall Socrates' myth of the cicadas, which is mentioned somewhere in the middle pages. Human beings so overwhelmed with the pleasure of singing that they forgot to eat or drink, and so died without even realizing it, were, through the favor of the muses, reborn as cicadas. They now sing evermore. They observe those persons who honor the muses and report their good deeds to the muses themselves. This is an odd moment in this dialogue, and yet it suggests the arc of the dialogue as a whole. Our time is best spent singing like the cicadas. That is to say, launching out from the impetus of myth and journeying towards the true and the divine. All along the way, we are virtually present by way of myth to the gods. Myth is the setting out, myth the return, and myth the annoying cicada sound that accompanies you all the way through life on your heroic journey. It's important, though, to note that not only is that sound accompanying you, but that's also them telling the gods good things about you. So don't complain to the cicadas. There's one argument. Our second one is that the work of art, literary or otherwise, is part of a way of knowing reality and in two different modes, which we might reduce, even though I'm not totally content with that, to making and mimesis. We mentioned Plato's Ion in passing above. The question that guides that dialogue is well known, and with its Socratic irony often begets laughter. Poor hubristic Ion the rhapsode believes that because he knows Homer's verse by heart, he also understands and so could provide a commentary on the nature of the realities those verses depict. Socrates insists that the rhapsode has to learn his thought, not just his verses, and this is something to envy. Ion takes the bait with this hint of praise and claims indeed that he does know the interior depths of Homer's thought, which finds expression in the verses, but which is not exhausted by them. Alas, as Socrates continues to question him, Ion makes retreat after retreat until it turns out he doesn't know anything at all. Socrates gives the final judgment. Ion is not a master of his subject, but possessed by a divine gift from Homer, so that you may make many lovely speeches about the poet without knowing anything. He concludes, that is how we think of you, as someone divine and not as a master of a profession. We could stay and laugh at Ion because it's a really kind of cute moment in the history of philosophy, but the choice that Socrates is with which he entraps Ion is really a false one. Either, according to Socrates, either Ion can demonstrate his knowledge regarding everything he recites, or he possesses himself no knowledge, but merely receives his verses via divine inspiration. But there's a third possibility that Socrates did not introduce, and he doesn't introduce it for a couple reasons. First, Plato is helping us to see, as he does elsewhere, that mere speech is not the same thing as giving a full account of reality, and that's true. And that a full account of reality will always rise up to what is universal, as applicable as to the poetry of Homer as it is to Hesiod, because comprehensive of both of them. But second, Socrates here is pretending that to give an account, to know, is a kind of possession, as if one contained the truth within oneself as a property, rather than for knowledge to be a simple standing before truth, as at the feet of a statue, as we gaze up in wonder at its heights. What goes unaddressed in the dialogue is the nature of the words that actually constitute the verses. What does it mean for Ion to be able to speak them? What does it mean for Homer to have been able to write them? So much in Plato would lead us to answer by dismissing the question. For Plato, words are appearances and not the reality behind them. Rhetoric by itself is no knowledge of the truth, is no technique, and is often enough a sub-rational bluff and pretense. But Ion has discerned the words of Homer. He has received the verse into himself and can recite it. And this speech cannot merely come from the god. It cannot merely be inspiration, as if out of nowhere. It is itself an act of discernment. The lines are their own knowledge. They are a tracing of appearances, a discovery of reality insofar as it gives itself to us in experience. It is therefore a manifestation of the form existence takes, even if it is necessarily a limited one. It is a limited one because it is the kind of knowledge that fixes upon incarnate experience and gives it a strictly incarnate expression. It is like tracing the face of reality with your fingers. This is what Jacques Maritain referred to as poetic knowledge, which he contrasts from the knowledge of metaphysics in the following way. Metaphysics gives chase to essences and definitions, poetry to any flash of existence glittering by the way. Poetic knowledge is incomplete, but so is the knowledge of metaphysics. The discernment of existence is complementary of the discernment of the essential. It is a language mired in probability. That is the case with all mythos. It seems not all the way through from existence to essence, and yet it does see, and it makes visible what the poet may be unable to explain, just as Ion could not explain. Even so, this speech occasions our own journey toward truth, as we saw above. What is it that the poet knows? Just that which he makes. The making is the knowing. And it's for this reason that so many painters across the last couple of centuries have called their particular oil paintings study in blue. Or other colors, but I literally couldn't think of another color. So just blue. All the paintings are blue. That's why nobody goes to the art museums anymore. Okay. We've got Bluey on TV. What do we need blue in the gallery for? So, all right. Here we come to a problem posed in very smug terms by the philosopher Etienne Gilson in his book, The Arts of the Beautiful. Gilson's aim was to show us that art consists of factivity and factivity and factivity in making and essentially nothing else. Yet all human activity entails knowledge, but knowing, yes, all human activity entails knowledge, but knowing of itself produces nothing. Only making makes, which is what we had suspected. The artist's knowledge consists exclusively of what leads to the making of the artifact. This knowledge stands on the far side of the artwork from the knowledge of aesthetic appreciation and criticism, wherein we see the finished work and discern its qualities and its meaning. So you can do just sort of a visual chart in Gilson's argument that factivity, making, leads towards the artwork, which is here in the middle, but then on the other side, coming towards the artwork is aesthetic appreciation, criticism, and scholarship, but also just the joy that we take in seeing the thing, indeed above all that. But while the artwork stands between these two activities, it also is an unbridgeable, it forms an impasse between them. There's no getting, says Gilson, from making to art appreciation or vice versa. Gilson then contrasts, in order to enforce this point, with the judgment of artists and that of the museum curator. The latter, a museum curator, will, in performing his job, in disinterested fashion simply choose the best works for display. But the artist's creative powers are always involved in his judgment, says Gilson. The artist will be partial rather than disinterested. He will perceive the tradition fully or fairly, but only in terms of his own work. Which Gilson rightly notes is itself the artist's criticism of the other works that have come before. So on Gilson's account, in other words, you wouldn't want to leave a particular artist to choose your museum's collection, but he's going to collect the works that have influenced him that he likes, and he's going to ignore everything else. Or he may get rid of all the works he likes so people won't know the source of his genius. The ghost of Harold Bloom just walked through the room. Okay. This argument strikes me as misguided, to say the least. Despite the rightful effort Gilson is making to capture the essential nature of the act of making as making, Gilson overlooks two things. First, that no artist is moved to making except in response to the tradition of making that precedes him. Poems are made of other poems, statues from other statues, formally if not materially. And yes, Ken Meyer's buildings are sometimes made from dancers, or at least their dance, gross otherwise. Right. The artist's work is not incidentally, but essentially an interior response to what has been given before. The new work is the fruitfulness of past works continuing on and forming a tradition whose conversation takes place between things made and thing made. As Meriton notes in the same essay we quoted above, one only has the idea of a thing when one can produce that thing. Gilson not only overlooks the connection between the artist's receptive knowledge and his productive knowledge, but secondly, he radically separates the judicious knowledge of the critic from the partial and biased personal knowledge of the artist. But here we see a reduction of the experience of art and literature to the specular, and this stands in defiance of the facts. We all take for granted, for instance, that unless one has practical experience of playing the violin, viola, or the cello, one will always remain at least a bit inarticulate regarding the nature and quality of a Beethoven string quartet. That is to say, the knowledge of the maker does not cease with the act of making. It is the practical means of gaining an interior knowledge of the meaning of a work of art. Learning to make from the inside is thus a criterion for learning to appreciate from the outside. In the past, it was a truism to refer to liberal education as the great conversation. All the great authors and every humane discipline were thought to be carrying on that conversation. To be educated into it was in fact to be initiated into that conversation as well, to become a participant in it. But we see this language as a mere fiction, unless one learns not simply what Plato argued, but how to argue with Plato. It is no less a fiction if one does not learn to see the Homeric poetic line, the plot forms of Dostoevsky, the conceits of John Donne from the inside, that is, as one who makes, however poorly, and not merely as one who stands merely on the outside in wonder and admiration. This is why I emphasize the misunderstanding of education, not only as abstractive and disengaged, but also as specular at the outset. There is only one way to cease to be a spectator or mere auditor and to become a participant in that great conversation, and that is to become a maker of new words within that tradition, to speak to our authorities in their own media, their own terms, from within the guild rather than from without. Socrates, in his words, is carrying on the conversation with Pindar, even though Pindar's words cannot answer him. This has implications for our third and final point, but before we turn to it, we must pursue one other implication, and that's one to be had in Aristotle's Poetics. Okay. I am gonna hurry this one up. Okay. In fact, I think I'll just read this part. Okay. The work in the world in which it takes place. Sorry, got to start that over again. There's no isolation of the artwork and reality from nature. The work and the world in which it takes place as one being among others have a certain intrinsic relationship. Aristotle speaks of the term mimesis, although other terms could be issued for that relationship. But in Aristotle's reckoning, the poem is a concrete singular that speaks of the universal, specifically the universal propositions of ethics, of good and evil, action and character. This movement from the singular to the universal is made possible by the probable. An audience judges the probability of actions represented in a play, and thereby judges whether the play is better or worse relative to how well it conforms to what the audience understands as possible in the laws of reality. The audience judges the conformity of the poem to its internal laws based on how well they conform to the laws of reality according to which things by nature may occur. But Aristotle also raises the question, or even the desirability, of the probable impossibility. And this is but one clue that not only do we judge a play based on our knowledge of the laws of reality, but a play may also judge us. That is to say, an encounter with a particular kind of plot may actually reveal to us that we have not understood the laws of reality adequately, that we may come to a new knowledge of the laws of reality. So there are different accounts of this relationship between the work and the world that have been given. Aristotle's is the most famous one, but Plato thinks of it in terms of poetic meter, the way in which the meter of the poem corresponds to the numbers of the cosmos. Augustine gives us something analogous where the verse line is a microcosmic analogy to God's eternal providence unfolding across this distended temporal movements of history. Goethe has an example that is also in that general ballpark of trying to account for the relationship with artwork and reality. I'll end with two things. First, my third argument. Hans Urs von Balthasar in The Glory of the Lord tells us in its early pages, first, that form is the primordial phenomenon. There's no getting behind it. So we have to receive form, aesthetic form, ontological form. And then he says, and I think this is on page 33 of the first volume, that the contemplation he's calling Christians to in the study of the contemplation of revelation exactly corresponds to the aesthetic contemplation that steadily and patiently beholds those forms which either nature or art offers to its view. So just as we stand before the painting, we stand before the poem, he's calling us also to stand before the full form of revelation, to see it whole, not to try to get behind it, but to receive it. But just consider what the previous arguments I've offered do to modify this claim of von Balthasar's. The seeming stasis of contemplation is in fact an internal dynamism. It is this movement of procession and return that guides the intellectual life. That journey is one that can't be taken by tourists. We cannot just be sightseers on the cabin cruiser. We have rather to enter into the work by way of the knowledge of making in order to see the fullness of things. Entering into the life of the church is a precondition to be able to see the form of revelation. we have also to recognize that even those concrete forms that seem potentially to be mere husks encasing some juicy nugget of wisdom, in fact, those forms are things that communicate laws to us and that must be contemplated fully intact rather than in abstraction. In order to test this hypothesis, I'm going to end by reading you a poem which I do believe summarizes everything I've said, but then in an exhaustible fashion, and I will let it be its own commentary. It's a poem from 1998, I believe, by the now deceased, only recently deceased poet Richard Wilbur, and it's called Mayflies. In somber forest, when the sun was low, I saw from unseen pools a mist of flies in their quadrillions rise, and animate a ragged patch of glow with sudden glittering, as when a crowd of stars appear through a brief gap in black and driven cloud, one arc of their great round dance showing clear. It was no muddled swarm I witnessed, for it's an entreshot. Each fluttering insect there rose 2 steep yards in air, then slowly floated down to climb once more, so that they all composed a manifold and figured scene, and seemed the weavers of some cloth of gold, or the fine pistons of some bright machine. Watching those lifelong dancers of a day as night closed in, I felt myself alone in a life too much my own, more mortal in my separateness than they. Unless, I thought, I had been called to be not fly or star, but one whose task is joyfully to see how fair the fiats of the caller are. Thank you.